Okay, well, I should say welcome to Edinburgh. So I'm originally from the Isle of Man, but I've been a student here on off for about 10 years now. Welcome to my adopted hometown. So this talk is based on my own personal experience as a member of the contemporary Manx-speaking community in the Isle of Man. So that's where the Isle of Man is from a Gaelic perspective, and on the other side you can see the rather sobering position that the Gaelic languages are in as community languages today in Ireland and Scotland. I'll also draw on my research as a scholar of the Celtic languages and a PhD student in the Celtic Studies Department at the University of Edinburgh. There's another map as well, two maps of the island itself. So once considered a thing of the past, following its demise as a community language in the 19th century and the death of the last traditional speaker, Ned Madrill, in 1974, the Manx language has enjoyed a significant resurgence in recent decades, being learnt by hundreds of adults as well as school pupils, as well as a small number who have been raised in the language at home. And this is of particular relevance to me because I have a 6-month-old son that I'm speaking Manx to. A significant development was the establishment in 2001 of a Manx-medium primary school, perhaps unique in Europe as a case of immersion education in a language which is extinct in its historical form. The revival of Manx raises a number of fascinating questions about the degree of continuity and rupture between traditional and revived forms of a language, and the role of individual speakers and the community in reimagining and remaking the language of their ancestors, or perhaps adopted ancestors. So the slide now up shows the main varieties and periods of Manx. I won't go into it in too much detail right now, but things will become clearer as we go on. And the main distinction throughout the presentation is between traditional and revived Manx, which is something of an oversimplification, but bear with me. And throughout the linguistic examples I'll give are color-coded in blue and red. So, as minority language communities worldwide increasingly face the cessation of intergenerational transmission and the processes of language shift and language death, the practice of language revival, meaning the revernacularization of dead, dormant, or sleeping languages, depending on the metaphor you prefer, languages attested in written texts, recordings, or linguistic documentation, is becoming more prominent and the study of it more urgent. In addition to the most well-known and in numerical and political terms most successful example of Hebrew, a number of examples of revival of indigenous languages in North America, such as Miami and Wampanoag, Australia, such as Gorna, and East Asia, such as Siraya, have been recently documented, with efforts often led or guided by trained linguists, sometimes these trained linguists being members of the indigenous ethnic group themselves. Older movements, on the other hand, such as those to revive the Celtic languages Cornish and Manx, which both go back over a century, have mostly been shaped by gifted and very committed amateurs. Within the Celtic languages, the topic of language revival, as opposed to revitalization of still existing speech communities, is becoming more significant as traditional speech communities are rapidly becoming moribund. So networks of second language speakers, for example, in the cities and towns of Ireland and Brittany, can often be seen as cases of language revival, since their links to traditional speakers are often tenuous. An increasing number of academic studies have examined the language movement, the Manx movement, from an ethnographic, anthropological, sociological, or historical perspective. However, there has been relatively little engagement in these studies with formal linguistic data from revived Manx speakers. That is to say, the grammar, structure, and vocabulary of the language, in comparison with the evidence of the traditional Manx corpus. This means that scholarship has not fully examined the complex interplay between language ideology, historical circumstances, the second language acquisition process, and the linguistic and orthographic peculiarities of Manx itself, as well as the nature of the long-standing contact between Manx and English, going back centuries when the language was still spoken as a community language. So today we will have a look at a variety of features of grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation whereby revived Manx, at least as practiced by the majority of its speakers, diverges in some significant way from the traditional language. We will see how these things illustrate various factors which can be seen to mold the speakers' and writers' usage and the ways in which the revival community has developed over the decades. So we are going to look at quite a lot of examples of Manx grammar and things that if you know Irish and Scottish Gaelic, you might be able to follow. If you don't, you might not fully follow the examples themselves, but hopefully you'll understand the broader points I'm making. So the speakers of revived Manx from whom the examples are derived vary in proficiency, but all can express themselves fairly fluently and confidently, and would generally be regarded within the community as speakers rather than learners. And the examples are taken mainly from a selection of written sources from the mid-20th century to the present day, as well as videos and audio recordings of interviews with revived Manx speakers, which have been published as teaching and learning resources on YouTube and elsewhere. And if anyone's interested, I can email you the sources and references if requested. So the first thing we're going to look at is substratal features from English. So as you would be expected from the literature on language contact and second language acquisition, and as all of us here, I think, are familiar with from everyday experience of learning a language as a second language, substratal features or interference from the Manx speaker's first language, usually English, are widespread. For example, the phenomenon of the loss of R before consonants and at the end of words, and intrusive R, as shown in these examples, are common. Of course, if you're familiar with the English of most parts of England, including also the Isle of Man, this is a familiar feature of many forms of English. So although both of these phenomena were found to some extent in the traditional Manx of the last semi-speakers or speakers, depending on how you classify them exactly, who were recorded in the mid-20th century, the details are somewhat different. So this is these examples now. So in traditional Manx, the loss of the R did not necessarily alter the preceding vowel, whereas in revived Manx, the vowel corresponds closely to contemporary English pronunciation, as current in adjacent parts of England, which of course is the dominant linguistic influence on the island's population today. So you have the verb to put or give, cur, which could lose the R even in traditional Manx of the last speakers. They might say ko, but you will often hear revival speakers saying cur, like the word for a dog in English. Similarly, you have durt, said. The traditional speakers might have said dut, but nowadays some revival speakers will say dirt. So the revived Manx pronunciation reflects more progressive forms of Manx English. So in conservative Manx English, so for example, I would say sure for "Are you sure about that?" Whereas a lot of people these days would say sure or sure, and this is common in many parts of the British Isles, and that carries over into how they speak Manx. So the next point is many revived Manx speakers do not consistently implement in their speech or even their writing the pragmatic difference between plain and emphatic pronouns, which is found in the traditional language. This is a feature of the Gaelic languages where you add a suffix to pronouns and various other words rather than expressing emphasis with intonation. So in native varieties of Gaelic languages, you can't say, for example, my house and his house. Rather, the stress remains on the noun. So you say, my house, suffix, which is quite counterintuitive for English speakers. So in example 6, the non-emphatic prepositional pronoun och at them is heavily stressed phonetically and is semantically contrastive with the speaker's reference to himself. However, the speaker doesn't add the emphatic suffix, where you would expect oxen, Gaelic achgason, Irish achabson, whereas it does appear as expected in the other, so he's contrasting their work and my work, so ems, so the S, the apostrophe S there, which is highlighted, is an emphatic pronoun used as expected. So there's inconsistency. And in some revived Manx pedagogical material, it seems that the simple form is consistently used in emphatic situations in order to simplify matters for learners, since perhaps the emphatic forms have not yet been taught at this stage in the course, which, of course, arguably causes trouble further down the line if they don't learn this. So in this conversation, Veluskiju, Tamiskiju, Koishaw, Shawmananan, Veleskiju, is he tired today? So you're contrasting with the earlier person being tired. But in traditional Gaelic, you would have to say, Velejanskiju, is he tired today? So you can't strongly stress pronouns without making them, putting them in this emphatic form. Another thing is that some speakers seem to have reanalyzed the emphatic pronouns as something a bit like the disjunctive pronouns of French, or the generalized disjunctive use of the object pronoun in English. For example, they are frequently used in circumstantial clauses introduced by as and, irrespective of the pragmatic or semantic nuances conveyed by the distinction in traditional Manx. And circumstantial clauses are a syntactic structure characteristic of Celtic and also Semitic languages. In example 8, the emphasis on ish, so this is she or her, the simple form being e, would in traditional Manx imply contrast with another actor, but no one else is mentioned in the passage. It's about the effects of her having to look after a baby, not about whether she or someone else is looking after it. So this is 8. Whereas in the traditional Manx examples in 9a and b, there's a plain pronoun in the first example, but there is an emphatic pronoun in 9b because there is an element of contrast there. So the first one, Natretan spirit de edacha de gaile, as a gedacha meshaven, as the hartleshaven rosha charn, ni in sagart colino uri uluan laisha. So when the spirit of jealousy takes him, and he's jealous about his wife, but it's the same person. He's jealous and he's jealous about his wife. He's not contrasting with someone else being jealous. Whereas in the second example, Tashuavagan peches morain tatnese yeregayachen, as gail fear alkrish scararu, ur na lugfadi de bultlesh chingus, as shoestru de vrinnerach rish lesh neer gayachen vitamelt roshen as huish de hacknese gelundu, ach uluans fardel. So here you can read the translation yourself. It's 18th century English, but basically that the child is fallen sick, and you are trying to plead with the child and look at his toys again. So there's an element of contrast there, which is expressed by these emphatic pronouns. So in classical Manx, 18th century Manx, including in the Bible translation, the English loan word back, the adverb, is generally used where erash would be usual in other Gaelic dialects. So for going back, returning. This was clearly very well established, as such a loanword might otherwise have been avoided in such a high status text. Erash also exists in traditional Manx, but it's developed specialized senses of flourishing or blooming or coming to light after being lost. So in 10a is an example of the English loanword back being used in the sense of returning, and then 10b is a traditional Manx example of Erash being used in the specifically Manx sense, which it doesn't have so much in Scotland or Ireland. But then in 11, you have a revived Manx example. So for many revived Manx speakers, Erash is used for back, and the traditional Manx sense of Erash, I think, is unknown to many speakers. Thus, a potentially useful semantic distinction is lost in the interests of purging the language of English words, whether or not we think that's a useful thing to pursue. But we do know that this sort of purism was a priority for some of the revivalists, such as the lexicographer Douglas Farragher, as this quote from the start of his dictionary shows in quite stark terms. It always appalled me to hear the last native speakers using English names. This unnecessary dependence upon English cannot be tolerated if the Manx language of the future is to survive in its own right. So this kind of very puristic attitude has been quite influential, even to the point of altering the language as it actually was used by native speakers. Another type of purism concerns the coining of new constructions, which apparently are felt to be closer to the spirit of Gaelic idiom and less similar to English constructions, regardless of whether the particular structure existed either in traditional Manx or other Gaelic dialects. And I've called these hyper-Gaelicisms. So in traditional Manx, I hope was generally expressed by the verbal noun threshtiel, which also means trust, in the progressive construction with the verbal noun. So tami threshtiel nach chitorum arachons meve. This is a 19th century writer saying, I hope I don't experience the like anymore in my lifetime. However, most speakers of revived Manx today, if you ask them how you say, I hope, whatever, will come out with this construction, streishlian, which, as far as I can see, is unattested in the traditional language, and even in the revived language was relatively recently became common in the 80s maybe. So streishlian literally is hope with me. And there's an earlier example in 15. However, in the other Gaelic dialects, in Irish and Gaelic, there are various ways of saying this, but not usually is something le, which, although such structures more broadly are very frequent in all the Gaelic languages, including Manx. So this particular example in revived Manx seems to be part of a wider tendency to expand the use of the copula and preposition structures, which are apparently seen as more distinctively Gaelic and less English, although objectively speaking, I am Xing and there is X with me are equally native and frequent structures in Manx. It's just that the first happens to be similar to a common English structure, while the second is more exotic from an Anglophone point of view and liable to be co-opted as an iconic badge of linguistic Manxness and explicit non-Englishness. And then there are what I've called hyper-archaisms. So especially in written revived Manx, there's a tendency to attempt to restore older features. So Cooley Draskow, another scholar, has noted a tendency towards increased use of inflected verb tenses as opposed to do periphrases. So this is like Welsh. Those of you who are familiar with spoken Welsh, you can say I did go or I went. Manx has both options as well, and to a much smaller extent the other Gaelic languages do. So these older verb forms have been restored to an extent in revived Manx. And then there's also restoration of forms which are assumed to be historically correct, in inverted commas, even when these may in fact have been ungrammatical in attested periods of the traditional language. So the Gaelic languages have a progressive verbal aspect formed with a particle, which is originally a preposition ag, as in the Irish example at the top, plus the verbal noun, so I am at listening, and so on. This progressive particle has been elided entirely in Manx, apart from the survival of the consonant g as a prefix on verbal nouns which begin with vowels. By the 18th century, so the Bible translation and so on, it had become usual to prefix this g to verbal nouns in all verbal constructions, including those in which the verbal noun is used as an infinitive and where it would not be historically expected. So in both 16a and 16b, we have examples where you have this g form where historically, etymologically, it doesn't really make sense, but that was the usual usage. And I have a very long article in the Journal of Celtic Linguistics where I have argued at length that these g forms had been reanalyzed as markers of non-finite verbs in classical Manx, to the extent that omission of the g, with a few examples for individual words, individual verbs, was probably no longer grammatical. In revived Manx, however, bare forms of the verbal noun without g are sometimes found, apparently in line with what is logically expected. So, hanodmid obel the vel maranan seliorsho. We cannot deny that there are errors in this book, a rather ironic sentence, where, from my perspective, if you were writing in 18th, 19th century Manx, it would be hanodmid gobel. Hajinum imre, hajinum gimre enam. So anyone that knows anything about Manx has heard about our infamous, very inconsistent and ambiguous spelling system, which is based largely on middle and early modern English conventions. I'm giving a paper somewhere else soon where I argue that it's not quite as bad as people think, but nevertheless it is quite complex and not always consistent. So the letters A, Y have a whole load of different pronunciations: A, O, O, E, A, and so on. So the word for happy, this is etymologically, we know what it is. It's a word that occurs in Irish, mener, menra. And we have attested pronunciations from native speakers as mendra, mendras, mendras. However, this tends to be pronounced manra, manrus in revived Manx. So they're taking taking it to be an example of the last pronunciation in 18 rather than the first. Basically, there's a dictionary from the 1930s where this manrus pronunciation is actually written out in a sort of phonetic spelling. So the Manx orthography usually follows the English values of the vowel symbols, so the post-Great Vowel Shift vowels, but sometimes the Latinate or French, whatever values are found. So this leads to confusion. For example, in example 22, we have two words spelt exactly the same apart from the capital letter. So Mayan is the Manx for Matthew, as in St. Matthew's Gospel, Sushtal and Nu Mayan. But Mian, as those of you that speak Gaelic languages will know, means desire. And I've heard them confused. I don't have an actual example, but I have heard them confused. So there are cases like that. And then there's some divergences from traditional Manx usage, which aren't really the result of English influence per se, but of internal analogy or overgeneralization. So structures appear which might appear to be logically possible, but which do not in fact appear in the traditional language, but are expressed otherwise. So the example with the g prefixing could be seen as an example of this. Another example is that in revived Manx, the negative copula hanye, so meaning something like isn't or it isn't, is sometimes found followed by ach, but, in the sense of it is only. Now you can combine ach with negative verbs in general to mean only. It's a bit like ne que in French, and so on, dim ond in Welsh. But this particular example, 24, I believe would be ungrammatical in traditional Manx, and I haven't found it in Scottish Gaelic either, except from learners, including in the blog of a well-known political journalist for the BBC. That was one of the only examples I found. Basically, I won't go into too much detail, but I think it wasn't grammatical because it mixes two different focusing strategies. Whereas in 25, you see an example from traditional Manx where you have she mi hin thon as a velon ach mi. So it is me and it's only me, but with a different structure when the negative and the ach are combined. Then we have misleading textbooks. So in traditional Manx, there's a complex preposition quae, towards or meeting, which is i gongad in Gaelic, and gongad, which behaves as other such prepositions with pronominal forms based on the possessive. So they're a bit like in English, for my sake and so on, for the sake of, where you have a simple preposition and a noun originally, and then sort of genitive after it. So you can see 26a, quail ri, towards the king, and then 26b, henkis, and then gwael, Jesus met them, literally Jesus came into their meeting. So this preposition quail, just the simple form quail, is well attested in traditional texts. But for some reason, a misconception about this has crept into various reference works. I give the examples in 27, going all the way from 1930s through to more recent books, where it's either stated or implied that the possessive is required even when a noun follows, which is against the sort of logic of how other such things work. So it's a bit unexpected. And it's remarkable that this idea has persisted so long, despite the fact no other structure in the language behaves like this. So it's a clear testimony to the abiding influence of successions of reference works by major figures of the revival, which have been accorded authority within the community. Yeah, and then 28, there are various examples of the construction that these textbooks are recommending, and then other structures sort of mix various things, and also the expected traditional structure is also used in Revived Manx in 28e. Although I've focused primarily in this paper on ways in which Revived Manx usage diverges from the traditional language, there are also certain features where elements of, for example, traditional pronunciation are maintained, even when they aren't indicated in the orthography. These can be considered part of the oral tradition of the revival, having been acquired by the mid-20th century revivalists who interacted with the final traditional speakers. And sometimes some of these pronunciation features seem to be maintained as a sort of badge of authenticity to show that you know what it's supposed to be pronounced like, even if it doesn't agree with the spelling. So there's a thing called pre-occlusion, which is in Celtic languages is a feature of Manx and Cornish, though probably no connection. This involves the insertion of a stop consonant before a final L or nasal consonant in stressed syllables. It's never been written in the standard spelling system, but it is quite often heard in both traditional and revived Manx. So it seems to, in revived Manx, it seems to be especially common in certain words, and therefore may be considered to have been lexicalized. So you have the word for sea, cuan in Gaelic, is cian or ciden in Manx, and you often hear this ciden kind of pronunciation from revival speakers, though it's not written. And some more examples, 29b. Then you have dialect, and the Isle of Man's very small, it's 30 miles long, but there were fairly small dialect differences, especially between the north and south of the mountain ridge, if you remember the map at the beginning. So speakers of both dialects survived into the mid-20th century and were recorded with, or interacted with the revivalists. Revived Manx speakers today tend to have features of both southern and northern Manx in their speech, although conscious awareness of these features as being linked to dialect seems to be low. However, in some cases, a pronunciation reflecting one particular dialect has become widespread, even if the spelling better represents the other dialect. So, for example, a diphthongal pronunciation of the word for head, which we saw in one of the presentations yesterday, was the northern pronunciation of kione, but of course the spelling, if you look at, have I actually got the spelling? It's written Kione, so kione, and that's how it was pronounced in the south, kione, or with the pre-occlusion kjoten, and in the north, kione, which seems to be the more common pronunciation. And then there's the word for old, 31, which is written shen, and if you know Gaelic and Irish, you'll know there's a variation between this, in this vowel. In North Manx it was shan, in South Manx it was shen, but the northern pronunciation, which diverges from the spelling, is the one more commonly heard now. But then there's also a few speakers, both those who had perhaps personal contact with particular traditional speakers and younger speakers using recordings or the transcribed material, who make a conscious effort to adopt one dialect or the other. For example, the revival speaker interviewed in example 32 uses the northern diphthongal form for the word for night. So in good night, for example, the most common pronunciation, which is in this case is the southern pronunciation, is now evi. That's what's commonly taught. But as the spelling indicates, it could be more like a diphthong. So in the north it was more like avi, in like Gaelic, va. So the interviewer said, who lives in the north, he's a very old man now, lives near where one of the native speakers lived, and he interacted with this speaker in the 1950s. He said, avi tui, avi in the north. So he's particularly proud of his northern heritage, if you like. So that brings us to the end of the examples, so you can breathe a sigh of relief. So I'm going to now talk a little bit for 10 minutes or so about what this all tells us. So I should hasten to add that I have mainly outlined, as I said earlier, some of the things that you find where revived Manx differs from the traditional language. There are, of course, also plenty more points of similarity and continuity. And while it may have seemed like I was pointing out errors in today's Manx, I should emphasize that I'm not making any value judgments from the outset, at least. True, the divergent features of grammar, pronunciation, and phrasing might be considered wrong, or at least strange, from the point of view of native speakers of traditional Manx, if any were alive, of course. But it's an open and contested question how we should actually regard these quote-unquote errors today. The linguist and scholar of language revival, Gilad Zuckerman, who specializes in Hebrew but is now based in Australia and involved in the revival of Australian Aboriginal languages, he has argued on the basis of Hebrew that revived languages are inevitably hybrids of the target language and the mother tongues of the initial revivalists, with the long-term features of the variety determined largely by the properties of the language as developed by the founder generation, that of the initial, in the case of Hebrew, that of the initially Yiddish-speaking fin de siècle Jewish settlements in Palestine, who had a much more decisive impact on Israeli Hebrew than the millions of immigrants who subsequently came to what became the State of Israel and learnt the language. In the same way, American English reflects the speech of relatively few 17th century, 18th century English settlers, much more than it does the many millions of speakers of innumerable languages who have immigrated and assimilated into American English since. So Zuckerman and Walsh also suggest that one must learn to embrace, celebrate, and champion rather than chastise the inevitable hybridity of the emerging language as they discuss the lessons of Hebrew for the revival of Aboriginal languages in Australia. There are, however, important distinctions between the case of Hebrew and most other scenarios of language revival. Unlike Hebrew, but like most, perhaps all other revived languages, Manx largely remains a second language, molded by conscious learning by relatively small numbers of adult learners in each generation, rather than being subject to the usual unconscious processes of language change during intergenerational transmission. In this respect, it is perhaps a more typical example of what to expect when a second language is maintained over the long term in small networks of enthusiasts and activists. And although there is certainly considerable continuity or inertia perhaps from previous stages of the Manx revival, nevertheless each succeeding generation of revival speakers remains in some sense part of an extended founder generation in terms of Zuckerman's analysis. Although this can be seen as a symptom of the relative weakness of the language revival and its failure to fully get off the ground in the sense of having a community of people of all generations that speak it as a first language, it can also be viewed more positively as empowering present and future generations of Manx speakers. The future development of the language is subject to their own conscious choices in a way not true of natural first languages, including now revived Hebrew, in which language change is largely an incremental and unconscious phenomenon, and deliberate manipulation plays only a small part. In a small network of speakers, influential individuals, groups, or publications can potentially have a disproportionate impact in changing linguistic norms and practices. So, basically, the features of Manx which I've described today are not necessarily so much set in stone as they might be had revived Manx gained a significant cohort of native speakers in the earlier stages of the revival, as happened with Hebrew. In such circumstances, it is unclear whether and to what extent, say, the puristic stances concerning the replacing of English loanwords will continue to be as influential going forward in revived Manx as they have been to date, and how far future norms will adhere to or diverge from the model of the traditional language. These questions are to a significant degree in the hands of Manx speakers themselves as they participate in an ongoing project of creative renewal and reimagining the language that they have chosen to reclaim or make their own. This brings us to the thorny question of whether revived languages such as Hebrew, Cornish, Manx, or even new speaker varieties of Irish should be regarded as, in some sense, new languages or continuations of their previous incarnation. How do we define linguistic life and death? Of course, these terms are metaphors, and there is never a perfect fit between the literal meaning of a metaphor and what it is pressed into service to describe. Needless to say, a language behaves very differently to an animal or a plant. And many authors have noted the widespread dislike of terms such as dead and extinct within language revitalization and especially language revival movements. And it might be argued that such preferences should be respected and followed by scholars. For example, Julia Salabank refers specifically to Manx in this quote. So she says that some fear that using the term language death may itself have a causative effect. Campaigners for the Manx language trace continuity via linguists and enthusiasts, and they oppose using the term language death for Manx, even though the last traditional speaker died in 1974. I'll return to this point in a minute, as the situation and range of views is perhaps a little more complex than Salabank suggests. In this passage, Salabank recognizes that death-related terminology such as decline, obsolescence, moribund may imply negative attitudes, although they also have specific technical meanings. The metaphorical nature of this terminology may be problematic, especially if agency is described to languages as if they had a life of their own, though I would argue you can't avoid these sort of metaphors altogether. Tygo Hifranoin, an Irish scholar who has written a number of research articles on Manx, also critiques the ideological basis of metaphors such as living and dead, which he claims derive from 19th century Romanticism. So he says that the metaphor of language as a living object has permeated popular as well as intellectual culture, so that languages are described as in danger, dying, dead, on their last legs, revitalized or revived in a similar way that one might talk about a hospital patient or a family pet. Of course, you can employ alternative and perhaps more positive sounding metaphors, such as Zuckerman and Walsh's reference to sleeping or sleeping beauty languages, which may be reawakened or reclaimed rather than revived. But such imagery is still anthropomorphic, and what is more, may lead to the mistaken idea that any sleeping language can simply be reawakened in its original form without change or hybridization. The following statement on the website of the New South Wales Government Department of Aboriginal Affairs utilizes this metaphor to dress up a language death denial ideology as objective fact, and what is more, as morally compulsory, while misrepresenting linguists as being unanimous in rejecting the terms extinction and dead language, and stating without qualification that these languages are capable of being revived. So when language revivalists or academics taking their side argue polemically that a particular revived language is not dead, all one can say is that it may well be dead according to whatever definition the writer of its obituary was using, if they actually know the details of what they're talking about, but not dead according to the definition their opponent is using, a point made by a Manx scholar in this passage on the slide now. So it is true that scholars and the agencies documenting language endangerment and shift have sometimes struggled adequately to describe language revival situations. This may be because cases of language revival have been infrequent in the past and the study of the phenomenon is in its infancy. However, it isn't clear that the indignant responses of language revivalists and their advocates in academia, which can blur assertion and objectivity, always help to clarify the situation. A good example of this is the furore which erupted in 2009 when UNESCO classified Manx as extinct in its Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger, which some of you may be familiar with. Letters of protest were sent from the Chief Minister of the Isle of Man and from several speakers of revived Manx, including children at the Manx Immersion School, who wrote in Manx and said, "If our language is extinct, then what language are we writing in?" In response, UNESCO changed its classification to critically endangered. While the affront felt by some members of the revived Manx community may be understandable, it isn't clear that classifications which aim to document language endangerment and extinction scientifically should be determined on the hoof, as it were, by popular protest, although, of course, account should certainly be taken of communities' feelings and perspectives. Language extinction is currently a worldwide epidemic, one felt by many stakeholders to be a tragedy, the scale of which needs to be properly recorded. Today, many extinct or moribund languages have some kind of second language activist community or revival movement, developments which are to be welcomed. But the extinction of the traditional varieties of the language as native community languages still needs and deserves to be recorded and not obscured or covered up for what you could say is a PR victory. So, yeah, that's eventually what UNESCO came up with as a sort of compromise. So the fact that revived languages are in some sense new languages rather than direct continuations of the traditional language need not necessarily be lamented or seen as a mark of failure to either be derided or covered up. Rather, the hybrid nature of these languages may be celebrated, as Zuckerman advocates for revived Hebrew, where he says we should acknowledge and celebrate its complexity and celebrate a beautiful hybrid language, as it were. Zuckerman also notes the practical downsides of failing to recognize that the traditional and revived forms of, for example, Hebrew, are distinct language varieties. He gives the example of the failure of Israeli school children to master the reading of the Hebrew Bible, because it's assumed that they should just be able to understand a text written in what's described as their mother tongue, when in fact the semantic and grammatical differences are quite significant. So if revived languages are seen as new languages, then it's possible to reconcile the idea that a traditional language is dead or extinct with the observation that the revived variety is very much alive. Although this may raise the hackles of some revived speakers themselves, at least on a first hearing, since they would prefer to say the language never died at all, it may be that this way of framing the issue is advantageous in the long run, not only for the purposes of dispassionate academic analysis of the phenomenon of language revival, if that, insofar as that's possible and desirable to be objective, but also for the revival community itself. This is because being upfront about the fact that your language is, in some sense, both dead and alive, A, recognizes the trauma and significance of the language death event to the community. B, recognizes and gives dignity to the last native speakers and their lived experience rather than erasing it. And at the same time, it recognizes the legitimacy of the revived language as a valid means of expression, badge of identity, and act of creativity of the new speaker community. And D, it gives full recognition to the effort and achievements of the language revival, because if the language didn't die, what's so significant about actually reviving it? And E, it allows for an appreciation of the unique needs and challenges of developing a revived language spoken predominantly by adult learners rather than native speakers, thus helping to make language planning initiatives more effective, because we do have to admit we're always going to speak English better than Manx. Even the best speakers of revived Manx are always going to have much richer English. English will come more easily to the tip of our tongue, so we need to recognize that and adapt and provide resources for learning the language at an advanced level. And I would argue that linguistic richness and distinctions of meaning, just nuances of the type that I described earlier with the back erash example, aren't things that we can dispense with. If we're going to be comfortable expressing our feelings in Manx, raising children in Manx, being angry and tired and frustrated through the medium of Manx without switching back to English, we need to be able to express fully what's on our minds with the broadest range of linguistic resources we have. So I was going to say a little bit more about that, but I think I'll leave it there and let you ask any questions in the break. Gura mai murau.